When I was in college, the gentleman that was in charge of doing the church relations and the giving at one time had been a home builder. And for some reason one day he and I were talking about building homes, and he told me about, and I don't remember if it was one of his houses or one of somebody else he knew, but a home that they had poured the foundation, but they had to re-pour it. Because when they went to put the sill plate on the foundation so they could build the rest of the house, it was so far out of square that they could not make it right. And so I don't know if the company that poured the foundation had used a bad square the day they laid out that foundation, or if they had some kind of blowout, or somebody was just really bad at building. But they had to tear out the foundation and re-pour the whole thing. Later, when I was in my first 2 full-time ministries coming out of college, I had the privilege of helping 2 different friends move houses. Now, I'm not talking to move from one house to another. They moved their houses 20 plus miles, both of them, from where they had been built originally to where they would reside in them in the future. Both of those families had to have new foundations poured that would match the house, so that when they brought the house in, they could set the house on the foundation. Now, I can also tell you from doing some construction work that you need to know where you're building so you know how to lay the foundation. If you're going to set a foundation in northern Minnesota, only as deep as you pour it in central Illinois, you know what you're going to have happen? It's going to move when the frost goes down. Because the frost goes down a whole lot deeper in northern Minnesota than it does here. And so you put the foundations go below the frost line, so that when the frost comes in and the frost goes out, the house doesn't go up and down. I can also tell you that if you're going to build a house in Southern California, you want to do the foundations differently than you do in Central Illinois as well. Because out there, if you build a house like you would here, lay the foundations like you would, the first time an earthquake happens, you know what's going to happen. That house is going to move and probably fall in on itself. Well, Jesus is going to remind us that foundations, the foundation of our lives, are important. In fact, he has done that throughout what we call the greatest sermon ever preached, or the Sermon on the Mount. He's instructing us about laying a proper foundation. And just like a house, you can redo a foundation. I've been a part of that too, digging out underneath of somebody's house so you could put new foundation in. It's a whole lot easier to do it before it's built. And just like that, a spiritual house, the sooner you put the proper foundation in place, the easier it is to get it right. But it doesn't end there. And so this morning we're going to look at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, and we're going to be called to consider the consequences and to build a solid foundation. So this is what Jesus says according to Matthew. And I have to tell you, I really wanted to include like a dramatic reading of the Sermon on the Mount. I thought, how long can it take? Well, evidently it takes like 20 minutes. And so I decided that if I was going to preach, and we were still going to have time for Ken to share about Little Galilee this morning, I couldn't bring one of those up and let you experience. But if you got the opportunity, if you could, you might go and find there's a couple of really good ones. Matthew that was done back in the 1990s. Really good. It's straight out of the NIV, but it's a really good retelling of the Sermon on the Mount. And there are a couple of others, but that one is there particular. But these, according to Matthew, this is what Jesus says as he comes to the conclusion of his Sermon on the Mount. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be like a wise man who built his house on a rock. And the rains fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house. And yet it did not fall, for it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like the foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house, and it fell, and its collapse was great. When Jesus had finished these words, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one who had authority and not as their scribes. The other thing I thought about doing was singing that great kids song from when I was a kid, the wise man built his house upon the rock. Maybe some of you, when you were a kid, you sang the same song in Sunday school. I don't know how old it is. I just know it's older than me. But when Jesus tells this story, there are a couple of things that are important for us to notice. One is there are two buildings. There are these two buildings, these two houses that are being built. And one of the things that I'm not sure I'd ever thought about, but commentator after commentator, as I was studying and reading this, pointed out the fact that more than likely, when Jesus said they were building two houses, these two houses looked a lot alike. That's the way it was then. You had a house plan, and everybody in the area basically built the same house. Kind of like you go into some subdivisions in cities today, and every house on the block for several blocks looks exactly like the one next to it. And if you're really lucky, the builder changed colors between houses so you have a better idea which one's yours. But more than likely, these two builders were building houses that looked very similar. You drive up to them, or you'd walk up to them. I guess they didn't do much driving back then. Cars hadn't been invented yet. But you'd walk up to these houses, and house after house looked pretty similar. And that's the way it is with life. I was thinking about this as I was studying this week, and if you go to Galatians chapter 5, and at the end of Galatians chapter 5, you know what's there. It's the fruit of the Spirit. Fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, and self-control. And you have to say them real fast so that A, you keep on track and get them right, or B, so nobody notices that you messed up. But you notice what Paul says at the end of that. Against such things, there is no law. And I got to thinking about this, thinking about these houses that look the same, and thinking about, for the majority of people in a culture, there are standards that everybody is going to live their life according to. And that's why we know when we look at somebody, we can say they're a criminal. Or we look at somebody and say they're deviant in some way. Because most people adhere to a certain set of standards. And so the lives of most people are going to look pretty similar. You get up like your neighbor in the morning and you go to work, or if you're retired, you get up in the morning and you go out and fuss with your lawn or with the flowers or whatever it is that you do to pass your time. And the truth of the matter is for most people, the lives that they live are very similar to the person next to them. And very few people are actually so deviant, so different that you notice that great difference. And we notice that in life, that the people around us they live pretty good lives, most of them. And in fact, I know from studying people and studying church and just being there, is that there are even people who will be at church on Sunday morning who are not followers of Christ. And they live about the same life as the people who are sitting in the pew next to them. And so you look at their lives, and Jesus is saying here that you can't look at people's lives and tell how good the house truly is. And so you've got two lives, two buildings that Jesus is using that look pretty similar. He says, but there's a difference in these two buildings. That there is a difference, and one of them is built on the sand. The foolish man builds his house on the sand. And that doesn't sound like that big of a deal unless you've been in that kind of setting. You build your house on the sand, and when Jesus is saying this, he's talking about people who lived in a place where those big floods, the big storms, they would hit on a regular basis. I mean, you could expect that you wouldn't get much rain most of the year, and you get most of your rain in a very short period of time. A very short window of time. You get all of your rain for a year, and if you built your house where the sand was, you were building in an area that was prone to have, well, I would have called them gully washers growing up. A rain that comes through, and all of a sudden this dry creek most of the year is flowing full of water and debris that has been accumulating for a year. And Jesus looks and he says the foolish man is like that. And if we take Jesus for what he's saying and we study the Sermon on the Mount, the 3 chapters of this greatest sermon, you find that what he's speaking of is people who build their life on the values of the world. And the thing is the values of the world are always changing. That they're always shifting, they're always changing. And when Jesus says you build your house on the sand, I got to thinking, when I grew up, in part of the country where I grew up, we would occasionally have dust storms. And by that I mean sandstorms, because most of the ground was sand. And it would get up and it would blow, and one of the things that would happen is things would change. Now, not quite as drastically as, like, say, if you lived in the Sahara Desert when the wind blows and stuff, the sand dunes completely change. But because of the wind, at times, parts of the country, part of the area where we live, things would change. Because the sand would move. It was not stable. And that's the way the world is. The world that we live in today, the values of the world that we live in today have been greatly shaped by Jesus and his church. Yet you look around our world and the things that were kind of held as unchangeable when some of you were kids now are looked at and laughed at. They're looked down on because, well, that's just not what our society believes. And the world's values change over time. And so if you build your life on the values of the world, you're always chasing and you're always looking at a moving target. And it's hard to put a foundation on a moving target. And so Jesus says you've got the one foundation there built on the values of the world. And then he says you've got the other foundation, the house that builds its house or builds the foundation on the rock, who takes the time, who takes the energy to go deep and to look for things that are solid and sure, and they put the foundation deep because they know that when life happens, you need to have something sure. And Jesus is saying this, and he's talking here about building our life on his word, or building our life on the commandments of God, and because they don't change. The commandments of God, the word of God, the truth of God doesn't change. Even though there are those who try to claim in the church that we should change the way we look at the truth of God, it does not change. And so you've got a solid foundation that's not shifting and not changing, because the Word of God has been the same since the beginning. And in fact, Jesus is saying, I was there in the beginning, and I helped set the foundations. And so you've got two buildings that are built, they look the same, but they're built on two different foundations. And Jesus is saying, just as he has in the last three things that we've looked at, Jesus is saying there are two choices. This is a binary decision. You're either ready to meet Jesus and go to heaven, or you're not, and you're going to be condemned to hell. You're either walking the narrow road or you're walking the broad road. Either you're listening to people that are speaking the truth of God, or you're listening to false prophets. Either you're really in a relationship with Jesus, or you're deceiving yourself. There's only two choices: on or off, with Jesus or against Jesus. And Jesus is saying to us, the wise man builds his house upon the rock. The wise man chooses to follow the way of Jesus. And so we've got two buildings, and then we have two storms. And I'm not talking about the storm that hits the foolish man's house and the storm that hits the wise man's house, because as Jesus tells the parable, that's the same storm. But there are likely two storms that Jesus is referring to here, and the first of those is the storms of life. The storms that we all face. It's the reason that we do things like this, because we face the storms of life. And the storms of life are many, and the storms of life are different, and the storms of life are of different intensity. And they come at different times, and you may be prepared and you may not be prepared, but the storms of life come. And you've experienced them. The death of a loved one, diagnosis, the loss of a job, the changes in your retirement account because of the way government is doing things. You name it down the line. Maybe it's a physical storm that comes in and destroys your house. We face the storms of life over and over again, and we don't know when they're going to come. We don't know how the intensity is going to be. But the truth of the matter is we face them, and our neighbors face them, whether they are followers of Christ or not. We're all going to face the storms of life. And they serve as a reminder that we must struggle for obedience rather than rationalizing sinful choices that can lead to devastation when the storms of life encroach. You see, the difference, Jesus says, is that if you're building your house on the shifting foundation of the sand, when the storms of life come along, you don't have the foundation there to stand firm. And you notice in the lives of those people that it is a time when devastation happens and they don't know how to deal with it. He says, on the other hand, if you're building your life on Him, when the storms of life come, you've got somewhere to go. Someone to go to, someone to turn to, something that you can look at that is deeper and beyond yourself to say, how can I get through this? Well, it doesn't mean that we don't question. It doesn't mean that we don't grieve. It doesn't mean that we aren't hurt. It just means that we have something deeper than us to draw on. And in my life, I have noticed from watching people, you can tell the difference. And even if you come into a church and you begin to look at people's lives, when the foundations are shaken, you begin to tell who is truly a follower of Jesus and who might just be here because they feel like they have to be. Because people face those challenges differently. And so you've got that storm, we've got those storms that we all face, and then Jesus, I think the way He tells the story, I think He's including another storm that we all have to be ready for, and that is the storm of judgment. It's the fact that this comes right on the heels of things like make sure you're on the broad road, watch out for the false prophets, don't deceive yourself, all with pointing to the reality that there is coming a day when Jesus Christ is going to return and judge the living and the dead. That there is coming a day of judgment that none of us can escape. It doesn't matter when this storm comes, and I can tell you that we don't know. We don't know when we have to be ready to face that storm. Because the truth is none of us are guaranteed our next breath. But when you breathe your last breath, you need to be ready to face judgment. You need to make sure that your life is being lived in preparation for the coming judgment. Because there are only two ends. When we stand before God, there are only two ends for that judgment. And none of us are guaranteed that our next breath might not be our last. But on the other hand, we also know that there is a very good reality that within our lifetime, Jesus Christ could return. And rather than breathing our last breath, we suddenly, Paul says, will be caught up to him and changed in the twinkling of an eye. When he will come to collect his followers and judge the living and the dead, and we may not die before then. We don't know. So we always must be prepared. Because judgment's coming, and there are only two ends to that judgment. Throughout Scriptures, it teaches there are only two choices. One is eternal life with Christ, with God, for eternity. Where if we are prepared, we are ready, we're building our life on Him, we're ready to spend eternity with Him. The other side of that is eternal death. Eternal punishment, however you want to refer to it, the separation from God for eternity. And Jesus says that when this judgment comes, there will be people who aren't ready. Foolish people who they hear the words of Christ, but they refuse to put them into practice. And the foundation and the building will determine where we find ourselves for eternity. And Jesus says that we should build our house on the rock. He says, taking the time to dig the foundation, or if you've been alive a long time, taking the time to make sure that the foundation is sure, and make sure that you continue to keep rooted in that foundation and keep building on the foundation is important. And then there's one more important thing that Jesus talks about, and that is authority. Because while I know a few things about foundations, if you're getting ready to build a house, don't ask me about your foundation, okay? Because I don't know. I don't know how deep to put the footings. I don't know how thick to make the walls. I've done some of that work, but it's only because somebody else has said this is what you need to do, and I just work alongside of the one who's supposed to know. But you look for somebody with authority. You go to somebody who can say, this is how deep you need to build the footings. This is how wide. This is how thick. This is the kind of stuff you need to put in there. And, well, Jesus is going to say we need to know the authority. Actually, Jesus and Matthew both tell us we need to understand the authority. And with Jesus says that He's going to tell us to build our house upon the rock, which is, He's saying His word is the rock, and He is the authority. You notice words like, whoever builds his house upon these rocks, the one who hears these words of mine and builds on them, that's the wise man. The one who hears and doesn't do, they're the foolish man. In saying that, Jesus is saying His words have authority. His words mean something. They have value. They have something behind them that makes them words that we should build our lives upon. It's similar to go back to the five antitheses that we looked at a couple of months ago now. And Jesus says there, you have heard it said, but I tell you. Those are words of Jesus saying, I have the authority to tell you something deeper, to tell you something different than the authority you normally hear. Kind of like going to a good architect, Jesus, we go to Jesus and He says, build your life on my words. He's speaking with authority. And then from Matthew's point of view, he looks at the crowds and he recognizes that they recognize the authority of Jesus as well. They go away saying that Jesus taught with like one with authority, unlike the scribes. The teachers of the law of their day, the scribes who were there to help the people know how to live and to live good lives. And they were the teachers. They were the ones people were used to hearing. And they come away from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount and they say, this guy teaches unlike our scribes and Pharisees. And there are different ways that would have been different. But one of them is the fact that they were teaching with what I would call derived authority. They had to get their authority from somewhere else. With Jesus, the authority was in him because he was God. But for them, the authority had to come from outside of them. It's like today. I don't preach and I don't teach by my own authority. I stand on the Word of God. It is a derived authority. They had derived authority. They also did a lot of quoting their previous teachers. So you would listen to them teach, and they would quote the more than I would even. I know some weeks that's hard to believe, but everything they said, they would try to go back to the teachers of a previous day, a previous generation, and say, this is what they taught. And you could look back and back. It went back for generations, where they would try to stand on the shoulders of somebody else to make their point. And there's a reason for that. For me, when I do it, it's because I want you to see that if I have some strange idea, I'm not alone. I'm not just pulling things out of a rabbit hat somewhere and telling you this is what you... I at least, somebody else agrees with me. And there's some backing to that. And it brings a little bit of somebody else's authority. And they did the same thing. They were not teaching just what they believed. They had authority behind them. Both that they derived from God and that which they got from other teachers. But Jesus, on the other hand, comes and he speaks with his own authority. This isn't a derived authority because, you go to the beginning of the book of John, and John says that Jesus was in the beginning. And everything that was created by him. And several other places, Paul mentions that Jesus is not just the creator, but the sustainer of all life. He was there in the beginning when God said, let there be existence. And he created the heavens and the earth. Jesus was there. When God set the foundations of the natural laws that we live by, Jesus was there. When God said this is the way things are supposed to work and this is how you're supposed to live in relation to one another, at the very beginning, Jesus was there. And so when Jesus starts teaching us how we are to live in relationship with one another, in relationship with him, in relationship with the Father, he's speaking on his own authority. He's not going back to somebody else's authority. Maybe some of the reason they recognized Jesus was teaching with different authority was maybe his words were different. Sometimes you find somebody they know what they're talking about because they use different words. Not that they necessarily speak over your head, but they use different words to talk about things. And you say, they know what they're talking about. They're not just trying to string words together and make you think they're okay. They know what they're talking about. And so maybe the words of Jesus were just a little different than the standard teachers. Maybe he used a different tone or a different emphasis when he was teaching. We know that the things that he taught were slightly different, but they weren't always completely different than the other teachings of other teachers. But somewhere in the way he was teaching, the people were listening to him and saying, this guy is different. This guy has authority unlike that of the scribes that we normally hear. We need to listen to him. And people recognize the authority of Jesus. And so when Jesus says that we should build our spiritual house upon his words, he's an authority we should listen to. I learned one more thing about building houses when I was driving truck 18, 20 years ago. And it happened that one of the places I delivered several times in that time was a home builder. And this was not like they built a house building system. Basically, they would build the walls, they would build the floors, they would build the sections of the roof, and then they would put them flat on a semi and they would drive them away. And when they got to where they were going, you put them together like a big jigsaw puzzle. And this is what they did. But I was talking to one of the workers, and I don't remember if it was somebody that was set in an office building or somebody who was working out on the lot or what. But we were talking, and they were telling, I probably was asking him about different things about their buildings and how they went about it. And he said, we have to build our houses different. He said, the ones that we build for around here, they're pretty standard. We don't have to do a lot different. This was in south central Wisconsin. He said, but just recently we're building one to go to northern Michigan, up into the upper peninsula of Michigan. And he said, that house had to be built different. And the reason is because the snow load in northern Michigan is a whole lot greater than the snow load in central Wisconsin. And you have to build the rafters and you have to build the walls to handle that load. And we can look at our lives, and while we may have the foundation built surely on Jesus, we also have to look at how we're building the rest of the house. It may look like the house of our neighbors, but we have to build it to withstand storms. So that when they come, the foundation is sure, and the walls and top of our house, our spiritual foundation, is great and sure. So when Jesus, like a wise architect, says that we must be careful how we build the spiritual foundation of our lives, we need to listen. And when he says that we have to build good, sure houses, we best heed his instruction. And you may have lived most of your life, and now you need to go back and reshore the foundations based upon the teaching of the Sermon on the Mount. Because when Jesus says these words of mine, he's speaking first and foremost about the 3 chapters that we call the Sermon on the Mount. And really, I think if you read the rest of the Gospel of Matthew, if you read the rest of the Gospels of the Synoptic Gospels, Mark and Luke, or even if you add in the Gospel of John, or you read the letters from the New Testament, what you find is that the rest seems to be commentary on the Sermon on the Mount. How do you live? How do you put into practice the things that Jesus taught in this great sermon? And we must be like wise builders who are building our houses and taking care of them so that we're prepared for the storms in this life, but most importantly, the storm of the judgment of Christ. Let's stand as we continue to worship this morning.